based on the land and the sacred places that shape their world. Their respect for their ancestors and Mother Earth speaks of a very unique value system that is much different from the modern, larger American values. The threat of global warming and climate change has put tribes in a precarious situation that puts a threat on their value system and their livelihood. Climate change can severely overstress tribes who've already been stressed economically and face developmental challenges. Tribes are sovereign nations that hold unique legal rights that require protection. So today we're going to have a chance to discuss these challenges and unique situation of tribes facing climate change. And we have a great lineup of speakers here today. So first we'll have Rebecca Tsosie, and then we'll go and have Margaret Hiza, and then third will be Scott Andrews, and then I'll come in fourth, and then finally Daniel Ferguson. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves and their topic. So each of the speakers will have a presentation time, and then we'll have a short Q&A after each presentation. So if you have a question, please prepare yourselves to ask the question after their presentation. Okay, and now I'll have Rebecca Tsosie. Thank you.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here, and to actually see this conference is amazing because I've been to a lot of different political venues lately, and I've been with some audiences who don't believe that climate change exists. So you're starting sort of at ground level with them, and you guys are way beyond that. So I'm really pleased to be here and to speak to you about some of the framework issues. The panelists that I have the honor to be with have done a great variety of field work with different Native nations here on issues of adaptation planning and within tribal communities, and I think that that's kind of the place to work through a lot of the ideas on the ground. But what I want to do is actually frame the policy issues. And if there are questions, that's fine, but I'm also happy to hold questions to the end of the panel to afford more time for the panelists. At the first juncture, I think that in any policy discussion, it's necessary to distinguish the two different levels of political rights that frame climate policy as it affects Native people and as it affects them globally, as well as here in the United States nationally. And so there's a key distinction between, here in the United States, between the political rights that derive from the relationship that the United States government has established with federally recognized Indian tribes, Alaska Native and American Indian tribes. So there is a whole constellation of political rights that affords the ability to participate as governments in adaptation planning for these tribes. And that, of course, is a bit different than the right of self-determination, which applies broadly to indigenous peoples throughout the world. And that is another source, a powerful source of rights, but I think the character of it is slightly different. So if I can just sort of set that distinction up initially and then work through the considerations that apply in adaptation planning. So in the United States, of course, federally recognized tribes have this status as domestic dependent nations. What does that mean? It means that they're in a government-to-government relationship with the United States, and that, of course, gives the federal government the ability to pass legislation to promote the well-being and interests of Indian nations. So, for example, in the area of environmental law, Congress actually passed amendments to the pollution control statutes, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, validating the sovereign authority of tribes as governments to regulate on the reservation within their lands over their members and people who come into their territories. That's a very important source of authority and certainly fits into the discussion of climate. It also means that the United States government has a trust responsibility to federally recognized tribes, and that, of course, is something that is applicable, for example, to limit the behavior of agencies, say they're managing a water resource or forestry resource where the tribe has a common interest. They have to abide by that trust responsibility, preserve and protect that resource for Native people. So that is another very important source of rights for federally recognized Indian nations. Now, for Native Hawaiians and for non-federally recognized tribes, they also have a status as indigenous peoples, but they are not able to govern a land base in those ways. So in terms of the impact of climate change on traditional Native communities that cannot exercise that level of governmental authority, that is a continuing problem in the United States. So when we talk about the political rights of federally recognized tribes, we are talking about the rights that derive from their inherent sovereign authority to govern the reservation as well as their members, wherever the members may be. Also their ability to exercise delegations of federal authority, as do the states. They are permissible governments for delegations of federal authority. They have the authority to enter into co-management agreements for areas beyond the reservation that intersect, for example, on cultural resources or forestry resources, so they can participate as governments in co-management. And tribal members, of course, are US citizens, and so they have participatory rights in terms of Congress and state bodies, transportation commissions, and the like that govern the rest of the state. Now, those rights compare to the rights of self-determination that pertain to all indigenous peoples. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Professor James Anaya here of the University of Arizona Law School is now the UN Special Rapporteur, held consultations. I don't know if there was anybody here that attended those consultations, but the Office of the Special Rapporteur is gathering data about the rights of indigenous peoples as peoples, knowing that indigenous peoples span borders, international borders. The Tana Atam Nation, the Yaqui Nation, those span the US-Mexico border, and on the north, obviously the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk and Seneca, etc., they span another international border. The Inuit people located in Canada, the US, and Greenland, those are peoples who live in a traditional environment and have rights as indigenous peoples to the lands, the coastal seas, the resources that they have always lived on. Now, the right of self-determination, I think, as a human right, encompasses both a level of autonomy in terms of the indigenous people's relationship to those lands, but it also validates their right to cultural survival to the extent that they are operating in land-based economies, subsistence economies, as they are in the Arctic. There is another set of derivative rights that really poses the question about whether or not the nation states of the world will respect those rights and facilitate effective planning, given what is going to happen and is already happening in terms of sea level rise, flooding, relocation, vast relocation in many cases of the indigenous peoples of those areas. So it's a very important human rights issue. Now, let me turn now to talk about, and obviously I know that we have limited time, so I'm just going to frame these ideas very quickly and we can always discuss them more. To the extent that tribes are not represented equally to states in US adaptation planning, or to the extent that the rights of indigenous peoples are not factored into the global discourse on climate policy, we run the risk of extreme injustice to indigenous peoples. and obviously there are other communities that are impacted, but those are the ones that obviously we're here to discuss. Now, in that area of climate justice, we have to look at how the politics work at the international level, the national level, and the tribal level to see within those spheres how effective policies can be made. At the international level, as all of you know, climate change is the ultimate problem, right? Because the agreement, if any, by the nation states to cap emissions or to do other things to avoid further harms is totally voluntary and consensual. And in an era such as today, where the economic interests of the United States align with development, there is a clear resistance to sign on to any binding emissions limits. So the effects on vulnerable populations, and I would include indigenous peoples and also the Pacific Island nations in that, they're nation states, but they can't do anything to avoid the harms that are being caused by international policy. At that juncture, I would like us to think about whether or not that right of self-determination in indigenous peoples as peoples should give a different level of access and responsibility at the international level. That has not happened so far. In terms of US domestic policy, as we all know, Congress has so far been unsuccessful in passing any broad-based national legislation to curtail greenhouse gas emissions. There is an active legal discourse right now that deals with the authority of the EPA, regulatory authority, to cap emissions under the air pollution statutes, Clean Air Act. There is another discourse about the ability of the states to act absent overriding federal authority, and what happens to the spillover effects when the states obviously get into the place where some of them favor caps and some of them don't to facilitate economic development. So it's that classic problem of federalism, and the Supreme Court is dealing with that right now. Well, what about the victims? Is there a cause of action for the harms that are happening to climate victims? And the answer is no, as a matter of domestic and international policy. As a matter of domestic policy, if you fall into the FEMA guidelines and you've done the right things, maybe you get some assistance that way. At the international level, you can lose your entire country, and there is nothing in the existing policies that demands that any country give you land, help you. It is humanitarian assistance at the voluntary consent of the nation states to deal with the harms. So that's not a very viable structure, and so far the nuisance cause of action, in terms of public nuisance, has been unsuccessful. Appeals to the Organization of American States by the Inuit under a human rights framework, also unsuccessful because it's very hard to pin liability on one actor. So where does that leave tribes in particular? Indian nations here are sovereigns, and so they are engaged in their own construction of adaptation planning. Obviously, it's not ideal to not have that level of access at the national or international levels, but there is a lot that can happen. And here, the exciting things and the things that my co-panelists will be talking about are, for example, given the traditional knowledge that exists among Native communities with respect to a particular set of lands and resources, how is that traditional knowledge going to be worked into tribal policy, national policy, or international policy? And I would suggest that there are two levels of that. At the first level, there is the level of traditional knowledge as scientific knowledge about the resource, about changes, about species, where they're located, what the experience is, how that differs from the past. That is an important source of knowledge. But the second source of knowledge is basically the ethical requirements. And that is very important because a lot of times indigenous knowledge gets dismissed as religious, superstitious, we can't work that into public policy because of the separation of church and state, blah, 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 blah. But the Declaration Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talks about spiritual rights as distinctive from religious rights. It is that relationship, intergenerational relationship between the people and the lands over time, inclusive of ancestral people and future generations, that provides an important source of ethical values about the land. So in my view, that is where climate justice needs to move. And it is the presence of indigenous peoples, as nations within another nation, that provides the opportunity for what I've talked about as environmental self-determination. And as we sort through the rights and we figure out what those international documents really mean when they talk about intergenerational justice, and some of the climate justice documents do, what does that really mean? And I would advance to you that we have to go beyond the economic model of ethics that drives utilitarian energy policy, environmental policy in nations like the United States, and have a more inclusive intercultural model of ethics that honors the place of indigenous peoples on the land. And that is the place where climate change is visible, where harms are visible. And I would like to recalculate the discussion away from the victim, vulnerable population discourse, who maybe gets some gratuitous help at the end, toward a powerful version of international self-determination, indigenous environmental self-determination into the future. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? I'm excited for you to hear the other presentation, so I didn't want to take too much time. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here. I wanted to thank Karletta for taking the time and energy to organizing this session today. And I'm going to be talking about the accounts of traditional elders on the Navajo Nation, which is an area here, actually not too far from here, north of here. And talking about the accounts of tribal elders, we've interviewed over 100 tribal elders at this point. And some of the arguments, the main points I want to make today are that this region is in a very long drought. It's by most meteorological records, it's been going since 1996. But I would like to submit that it's actually started a couple of years earlier. But because it takes a while for those impacts to be seen, people didn't realize that the drought was really there until 1996. And there's a big debate now about the impact of this prolonged drought, whether you can separate out the impacts of temperature increases during drought and temperature increases from climate change. And with the information that we have gathered from tribal elders, as well as the meteorological records that mirror that information, I would like to subject to you that now, with climate change, the drought impacts have been significantly magnified, and they're having enormous ecological effects that are very well accounted in the observations of tribal elders. The Navajo Nation is in the four corners of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Well, it's not in Colorado, but it's in the four corners region of those states. It's a large area about the size of West Virginia, and it's characterized by bimodal precipitation patterns. So there's winter moisture and then there's a summer monsoon. And the timing of those two wet seasons is very, very important. And they're divided by a dry, windy season. So depending on when the arrival of the monsoon is or how much winter moisture is there, it makes a big difference in the drought impacts. To understand what impacts happen on reservations or on tribal lands, you need to really step back and look at the history of those places. The Navajo Nation was established over a long period of time in different pieces of land were set aside. within the traditional, within the four traditional mountains that define the Navajo homeland, but it's also in the driest part of that traditional homeland. This is a map that shows the redder areas are the areas with higher temperature and lower rainfall, so areas with lower average moisture. The greener areas are the wetter areas, and the red area pretty much mirrors where the Navajo Nation is located today. This is pretty typical of Native American lands, because as this country was colonized, the more desirable lands were colonized by people who came to this country. So in the accounts of tribal elders, we see a lot of changes that you might not see in other places. It's a remote area that's very poorly monitored, and it's in the driest area of, sort of on the edge of a desert, let's put it that way. So that's where you're likely to see magnified effects from drying conditions first. The information that we've gotten from the interviews is very closely aligned to what physical data sets we can find, but it also gives us a better idea, as I said, of the ecological changes. So these are some of the summaries of some of the changes that people have in individual interviews said, and it's amazing how one interview after the other interview after the other interview will say the same thing. Everybody agrees that there's less snow today. Everybody agrees that it's hotter and drier. Everybody agrees that there's more blowing dust and sand, and that there's that it's windier. And they also talk about a lot of environmental changes that have taken place as a result. If you look at the precipitation record, this is an average of 6 weather stations on and near the Navajo Nation. The time period of 1944 that I have highlighted here is about the time when everybody says things switched from being wet to dry. And here in the Southwest, you know, things switch back and forth from wet to dry over multi-decadal cycles. But since that wet period in the early 1900s, we really haven't gotten as much moisture. The other thing that they mentioned, as I said, was decreasing snowfall, and the average annual totals of snowfall on and around the Navajo Nation do bear out that observation. And of course, this is coinciding with increasing temperatures. Some of the environmental changes that they have noticed are, well, the disappearance of birds like cranes and herons that you would expect to see around bodies of water, bees and locusts disappearing, beavers disappearing, the disappearance of cottonwoods and willows and other riparian plants that need moist and cool conditions. And those environmental conditions make sense also in the sense that the surface water features on and around the Navajo Nation have also changed dramatically over the past century. This is a map that shows information from different USGS professional papers. So the yellow areas are where a USGS professional paper in the 1920s published the location of perennial flow, when streams are flowing all year round. Then there was another professional paper that was published in the 1960s, and they noted the green areas as being areas where water is flowing all year round. And then we have, you know, different things like PhD theses that note where perennial flow is that we've added to this map. But the upshot is that this is where the only remaining perennial flow on the Navajo Nation is today. So that's the only stream flow that flows all year round. And these changes don't coincide temporally or spatially with development or with the drought, really. These things were in play before the drought occurred. So the lack of surface water features in this drying trend is superimposed on the drought we have now. So, you know, one of the observations, as I said, is that today there's north blowing sand and dust. If we look at migration and the movement and growth of sand dune fields, which are a a result of warmer and more arid conditions. There are actually dune fields that didn't exist in the 1930s, that began to form in the 1950s during the 1950s drought, which have continued to migrate and grow since then. So the drought conditions that people are facing on the reservation today are pretty serious. There's very limited water supplies. People are driving farther and paying more for their water. The rangeland conditions have really deteriorated. And there's a lot of things, there are not that many options left to people. You know, there's very poor socioeconomic conditions. So a lot of people actually are holding onto their livestock, although they know they can't do that for very much longer. But since the livestock reduction period in the 1930s, grazing districts were set up where people could not move their livestock depending on what the conditions were. They can't rely on their clan relations that are outside their grazing district. And so the cattle end up staying, the cattle and the sheep end up staying in one place, whether it's wet or whether it's dry. And that has also contributed greatly to the problems. And these are the same problems that pastoral people have been facing around the world, indigenous people, as the routes where they move their animals become more and more restricted over time. Thank you.
Anybody have questions for her? Hello, my name is Scott Andrews. I'm environmental manager for the Swinomish tribe, and on one of my slides I'll show you a map of where that is. I've worked for the tribe in that capacity for 11 years now. Came to it from a variety of backgrounds, including I got my master's in watershed management and forestry right here at U of A, so I don't know if there's any U of A grads here. Hold the applause down, please. And in that capacity, do a number of things for the tribe, including all the environmental regulatory programs. Under me is also an air quality management program, hazardous waste, weed control, upland vegetation, habitat restoration, and then odd programs that just seem to come out of other duties as assigned, like climate change adaptation. My talk is the local response to climate change. We're looking at Swinomish as a case study. Let's see if I can work this thing. The Swinomish Reservation is in Washington State, about an hour drive north of Seattle. You can see on the map, there's an island, Fidalgo Island, that's just off the mainland, separated from the mainland by a narrow channel, the Swinomish Channel, and then this area, this lobe of the island is the reservation. It's about 7,500 acres upland or dry area and another 3,000 of tidelands. And as you can see from this air photo, pretty much surrounded by water except for the tiny connection here to the upper part of the island, but the rest of it is water all around. You'll see in a map, this is an agricultural area behind a dike. Up here is our major economic development area. Down here is the main tribal village. There are some leased lands here that are leased mostly to non-tribal members. And then over here, there's a lot of property right along the shoreline that is owned by non-tribal members, and I'll get into that and the problems that creates in a minute dealing with climate change. So we first